The Roman Republic, one of history's most iconic political ideas, a perfect system of checks and balances designed to disperse power amongst a population of loyal citizens, led by noble and patriotic magistrates who served at the pleasure of the people who made up the great state of Rome. You would be hard-pressed to find a political system as influential on the course of human history as the one dreamt up by the Romans 2.5 millennia ago. Throughout the ages, many people have harkened back to this ancient ideology when trying to figure out how to best organize and govern a large group of people. To this day, many of the world's nations consciously imitate the Republic's structure, its iconography, and its greatest figures and heroes.
Like Cincinnatus, I am returning to my plough.
Rome's Republic seems so enlightened, so complex, and so, well, almost modern, that it can be easy to forget how barbaric this age actually was, with things like slavery and the massacres of entire populations being commonplace. However, the Republic's beauty and sophistication is overshadowed by its ultimate failure. A brief glance at a timeline of Roman history will reveal that, after enduring for centuries, the Roman Republic would fall away in favor of an imperial regime. Elected magistrates would be replaced by emperors, who ruled the empire as monarchs in all but name. Elections would give way to military coups and palace intrigues. The Republic would die a slow death until there were no Romans left who remembered her in her prime and still had the will to fight for her. What happened to Rome's pride and joy? How did a people accustomed to democracy come to accept despotism? When and how did the Roman Republic fall? To understand how the Roman Republic ended, we have to understand how it started. And to understand that, we have to talk about how the Romans themselves started. The Romans themselves believed that they were the descendants of Trojan refugees, fleeing the armies of the Greeks. The story goes that the Greeks, hidden inside of a wooden horse, captured and then destroyed the city of Troy, and the survivors, led by one Aeneas, the son of the goddess Venus, then settled in Italy. Centuries later, in 753 BCE, descendants of these Trojan travellers, two brothers, decided to found a city on the river Tiber. They had a bit of a disagreement regarding the planning of the settlement, and that was quickly resolved when one of the brothers butchered the other one. The surviving brother, Romulus, then named this new city after himself and became its first king. Rome would have a total of 7 semi-mythical kings who would rule over the next roughly 2.5 centuries, until the whole system came crashing down due to the crimes of the final monarch, or more specifically, the crimes of his son. When the king's son took advantage of his royal power and forced himself on the wife of a nobleman, all of the other aristocrats decided enough was enough. One of them, a man named Brutus, would rally them together and drive the king and his family from the city. Instead of simply crowning a new king, they decided that the governance of Rome should be left to the general public, which at that point was a fairly small community, and thus they started the public thing, or the res publica. The Roman Republic was born. From here on out, the Roman state would be controlled by a senate, a small group of aristocrats who proposed and debated policy amongst themselves. From this small group, magistrates would be elected, amongst whom the various responsibilities and powers of Rome were divided. This was called the cursus honorum, or the path of honour. Any aspiring Roman politician would start as a quaestor, the guys in charge of state finances. After that, they might run for election as an aedile, the guys in charge of public works, construction projects, and festivities in the city. After that, they might get the praetorship and oversee the application of the law in the courts. But there was no magistracy as powerful or as coveted as the consulship. Anyone who was lucky enough to get elected consul would find themselves the senior magistrates of Rome, the leaders of the Senate, the supreme justices, and the commanders-in-chiefs of Rome's armies. For 1 year, maximum, at which point elections would be held and new consuls would be voted in for the next year. Also, there were 2 of them, each with the power to veto the suggestions of the other. Here we see the key trait that defined the Roman Republic. Although the kings of Rome were largely remembered fondly by later Romans as benevolent autocrats who did good for their city, the scar left by their 7th and most tyrannical monarch ran deep in the Roman psyche. The Republic had one great overriding purpose: to prevent too much power from ever landing in the hands of one single individual. It is hard to overstate how big of a deal this was for the Romans. There was no crime greater than the desire to become a king. There was no one regarded with more suspicion than someone who seemed to hold an unseemly amount of personal power, and there was nothing scarier than the thought that their beloved city might one day fall back into the hands of an autocrat. But just because they'd expelled the kings didn't mean that everything was hunky-dory for the Romans. The introduction of a few democratic elements to the political system hadn't turned the city into a place of equality. In fact, a great divide ran down the centre of Roman society, the divide between its two social classes, and the conflict between these classes would largely define the Republic's life for the first 150 years of its existence. The first of these classes were the patricians, people who could trace their family lineage back to the founding of Rome. This small group of clans kept a tight grip on political power, believing that their noble blood gave them greater spiritual insight and wisdom than anyone from outside of their tribe, and they maintained this power by interbreeding with each other and barring entry to the group for outsiders. Everybody else was a plebeian. Now, plebeians could still be citizens with all of the legal and political rights that came with that. Plebeians could even become very, very wealthy. But if they lacked the patrician family lineage, they were permanently barred from ever running for a magistracy or a priesthood, or really any official office that would give them any power whatsoever in the republican system. Throughout the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, tensions would continue to rise between these two social classes: the plebeians, who wanted more political agency and power, and the patricians, who jealously guarded it. This all eventually bubbled over into something called the conflict of the orders, which is a long and complicated chapter of Roman history that summed up, basically, the plebeians managed to wrestle quite a few of the important concessions they wanted from the patricians. Eventually, the plebs won the right to stand for magistracies. All of them, even consuls, could be plebeians. They also won their own assembly, where the plebs could all meet and debate and discuss proposals given to them by the Senate. But most importantly, they got their own magistracy. The tribune of the plebs was an office designed to ensure that the Senate and the patricians could never act against the interests of the people of Rome. They were elected annually from plebeian families exclusively. If you were a patrician, you couldn't even run for election. And their powers were pretty vast in scope, so they had absolute power of veto over anything that happened in Rome. All of state business, they could stop it, if they perceived it to be against the interests of the Roman people. They were also sacrosanct, under the protection of the Roman pantheon. To harm a tribune while they were in office was not only a crime against Rome's laws, but against Rome's gods, an unforgivable offense. And so, with this internal conflict mostly resolved, the Roman Republic flourished and endured. Soon, rejection of the idea that a single man could ever rule over the Roman people became an integral part of their identity, as did participation in public life, the military, and politics. So providing that you were a free, well-off male with citizenship, the Roman Republic was a pretty good deal, which is probably why it lasted for such a long time. Even the Greeks, who were very much in the habit of looking down their noses and sneering at anything done by foreigners, couldn't help but compliment the system. The 2nd century Greek writer Polybius really admired the Roman Republic because he thought that it perfectly combined all of the best elements of the political systems that he was familiar with from the ancient Mediterranean. You had the monarchic element in the form of the elected consuls who, for 1 year, could kind of act as the personal representatives of Rome, heads of state, as it were. Then you got the oligarchic element, which was the Senate, a group of well-educated and noble aristocrats who were always ensuring that their city was being governed properly. And you had the democratic element in the form of the People's Assembly, where voting could take place and the interests of the regular plebs could be heard and talked about. All things in perfect balance with each other, or at least in theory. The reality of the Roman Republic, as we will see, could be quite different. Okay. Time to start the actual video. The Romans were raised to venerate and emulate their ancestors. This was called Mos Maiorum, or the way of the ancestors, and it refers to all of the customs, traditions and behaviours that, even though they weren't inscribed into Roman law, were just the way things had always been done. On a societal level, this led to a broad trend towards social conservatism, but individually, young Romans were taught to model themselves on their direct ancestors in a very literal sense. If your father or grandfather had been a consul, you should aspire to be a consul as well. If you came from a family of great warriors, you ought to live up to that reputation. Your family set a bar of achievement that you had to either meet or raise in your lifetime, and this fostered a great deal of ambition, one of the reasons that the Romans were so obsessed with their public life. If you came from an aristocratic family full of prestigious ancestors throughout Roman history, living a quiet and unassuming life simply wasn't an option. You had to meet the standard set for you by your dead relatives. In 163 BCE, a child was born who had truly enormous boots to fill. A young Tiberius Gracchus was only a child when his father died, but it had been a father who had served 2 consulships and been awarded 2 triumphs. A certified Roman legend. As if living up to such an incredible father wasn't enough pressure on the young Tiberius, his maternal grandfather was none other than Scipio Africanus, one of the greatest generals in Rome's history. It was he who had defeated Hannibal and saved the city of Rome from the hated Carthaginians. And those were just his dead relatives. His brother-in-law was Scipio Aemilianus, the greatest living Roman. But most importantly, there was his mother. Tiberius's mother, Cornelia, was a woman of such prestige that when Tiberius's father died when he was only a boy, she was proposed to by none other than the king of Egypt. And she turned it down. Imagine holding such pedigree that turning down marriage proposals from literal royalty is even an option. Cornelia had already made a decision, however. After the death of her first husband, she would never remarry so that she could focus all of her energy and effort to the raising of her children. As a result, Tiberius got the best possible education available to a Roman boy at the time, but it was all geared towards the future that his mother had pre-prepared for him. All of his other relatives were known as the greatest Romans of their day, and the same would be true of her son. When he was only an adolescent, a young Tiberius was chastised by his mother, who would say, "People still know me as the mother-in-law of Scipio Aemilianus, when they should know me as the mother of Tiberius Gracchus." And so a young Tiberius had a great deal of pressure on him to go out there and become a great Roman hero who would be remembered forever. So it's hardly a surprise that as soon as he was old enough, he got out into the world and tried to make a name for himself. When Tiberius was still a teenager, Rome had gone to war against its ancient enemy, the Carthaginians. There had once been a time when the power of Carthage dwarfed that of Rome. It was a huge and wealthy empire that could afford to send huge armies of mercenaries, including war elephants, across the Alps to invade Italy. They had handed out severe defeats to the Roman legions and come this close to permanently ending Roman civilization. However, after losing 2 wars against the Romans, the Carthaginians were a shadow of their former self. But despite having the upper hand, the Romans were having a hard time actually dealing a death blow to the Carthaginians. They had defeated their armies in the field. They had reduced their territory to a fraction of its previous size. But the city of Carthage itself was still formidable and well defended, and the conflict that would eventually be known as the Third Punic War had devolved into a 2-year-long grueling siege of the city. The Senate wanted this war won, so they sent out their best general, Scipio Aemilianus, who, probably at the behest of Cornelia, agreed to take along his young brother-in-law Tiberius as a junior officer. And so Tiberius and Aemilianus went to Africa, and upon arriving they decided that all of this sitting around and waiting for the city to starve was completely unproductive. they prepared to take Carthage by storm. The final Battle of Carthage was a hard-fought affair. The Carthaginians knew that they were fighting for their very existence, and they forced the Romans to clear the city street by street, killing thousands in the process. When the city finally fell and went up in smoke, much of the populace opted for mass suicide as opposed to capture and enslavement by the victorious Romans. The sight of the fall of such an ancient and prestigious city and watching its population being annihilated was such a visceral and horrendous sight that even the grizzled old General Aemilianus was brought to tears by it, imagining what it would be like to see his own beloved homeland suffer the same fate. But for Tiberius, the Battle of Carthage was an immense success. He had been suicidally brave in the initial storming of the city, and he'd even been recognised as being the first Roman to set foot on the enemy's walls. When he returned to Rome, alongside his brother-in-law, he was greeted with a hero's welcome. He was well on his way to emulating the deeds of his father. But this was only the start of Tiberius's quest to complete the cursus honorum. Reputation as a war hero solidly established, he ran for election in 137 BCE and became quaestor, the first step on the way to the consulship. As a junior magistrate, only in his mid-20s, he was attached to the staff of a more important guy, the consul Gaius Mancinus. This was fantastic. He was a young man at the start of his career, and he already had a great reputation, and he was rubbing elbows with the most important people in the city of Rome. However, Tiberius's luck soon ran out. The Greek biographer Plutarch describes Gaius Mancinus as a good man, but an unlucky one. And as part of his duties, Tiberius would have to follow him to Rome's new territories in Spain, where glory would be far harder to find than it was in Africa. At this time, Rome was engaged in a war with a group of Spanish Celts called the Numantines, and this war was kind of like Rome's Vietnam. They were struggling to subdue a foe who they outgunned and outnumbered, and despite the massive power and resource disparity, Rome simply couldn't defeat the Numantines, an enemy who were perceived as being too far away to really pose a threat, and not wealthy enough to really be an attractive prize for the Roman people. As a result, the war had become unpopular in Rome, and morale in the army was low. And Tiberius would find himself right at the centre of one of the worst catastrophes of the entire Numantine War. Gaius Mancinus got together 20,000 soldiers and marched deep into Numantine territory. There he was bloodied in a couple of unsuccessful skirmishes, he panicked, and he attempted an ad hoc and chaotic withdrawal under cover of dark. However, the Spanish tribes were wise to him, and they surrounded his entire army. Tiberius, Mancinus, and 20,000 Romans faced certain annihilation. Gaius Mancinus, seeing the impossible odds, tried to negotiate. But the Numantines would only make a deal if Tiberius was the one to broker it. Even in far-off Spain, Tiberius still lived very much in the shadow of his father, who had once been posted to the province. And the Numantines knew that the Romans were very much in the habit of breaking deals that they'd made with uncivilized barbarians. But they knew Tiberius's father, and they knew him as one of the few Romans who would always hold up his end of a bargain. So Tiberius and the Numantines drew up a peace treaty, one that was obviously quite favourable to the Celts, but the Romans weren't exactly losing out either. Remember that Tiberius, Mancinus and the whole army are completely surrounded, miles from any help, in enemy territory. If fighting resumes, they will all be killed. Tiberius manages to secure them safe passage out of the territory and back to Rome. He saved 20,000 lives. When Tiberius returned to Rome, having surrendered and made peace, he probably wasn't expecting the same kind of hero's welcome that he'd enjoyed when he returned from Carthage. But he also wasn't really prepared for the sheer amount of vitriol spat at him by the Senate either. Surrender? What a shameful thing for a Roman to do. Why did he not stay and fight to the death like the Spartans at Thermopylae? Gaius Mancinus, for his part in the debacle, was stripped naked and returned to the Numantines in chains as a sign of Rome's rejection of the treaty he had signed. Tiberius, though spared this kind of punishment, was ostracized from political life. It was over. Tiberius's career, which had started so promisingly, was as dead and gone as the city of Carthage that he had helped destroy. He was supposed to rise to the top of the cursus honorum like his father had, and he had fatally stumbled at the first hurdle. How could he go home to a mother who had geared him to become the greatest Roman of his day and tell her that he had brought disgrace on the family name? How could he ever step in the Senate House again after the abuse that had been hurled at him and Mancinus after this disgraceful affair? To make things worse, his own brother-in-law, Aemilianus, the man who had given him his first leg up in public life, cut ties with him and took command of a new offensive against the Numantines. It would be his own brother-in-law who invaded the territory of the people that he had made peace with, a peace treaty that he had signed with his own honour. He had no family, he had no reputation, and he had no career. Change of scenery to represent change of subject. Here we go. Let's take a second away from the story of Tiberius Gracchus to examine exactly what was happening in Rome during his lifetime. Because even though the Romans had conquered themselves a nice big empire, our ancient sources paint a pretty bleak picture of Roman society in the late 2nd century BCE. To understand the problem with Rome in the time of Tiberius Gracchus, we have to talk about two core components of the Roman identity: farming and warfare. Now, I'm going to dump an awful lot of information on you in this section about agriculture and military life during the Roman Republic, and only some of it is relevant to our story here. So, if you're too gripped by the story of Tiberius Gracchus to take a break and deviate down into Roman agricultural life, fair enough, I completely understand, no hard feelings. Skip to this bit of the video and I'll pick up the story of Tiberius where I left off. Fair enough to you. I promise I'll sum up all the important bits. For the rest of us, we're going to talk about warfare and farming. Let's start with warfare. The armies of the Roman Republic were not the professional legionaries that are commonly associated with Rome's military. Rome at this point doesn't have a standing army. Not yet. You know, that'll come along later. At this point in Roman history, the Roman armies are made up basically as a citizen militia. It was the average Roman citizen who would answer Rome's call in time of need. If ever the city were threatened by Gauls, Greeks, or Samnites, the regular people would equip themselves out of their own pocket and go off to fight. This was a mark of immense pride for a Roman citizen. The Romans identified themselves very closely with martial prowess. The other core identity of many Romans was as a farmer. Although the city of Rome was where everything happened in Roman life and politics, the majority of Roman citizens lived in the countryside, outside of the cities, where they worked on small family-owned farms, sustaining themselves and their community. It's hard to emphasize how important this actually was to the Romans' idea of themselves. They didn't just practice an agricultural way of life in the same way that basically all ancient peoples did. Agriculture was their way of life. Venerable Roman statesmen like Cato the Elder would create works of Latin literature based on the subject of farming. Agricultural metaphors and references were common in political rhetoric, and anyone who made their living off any other means than farming would be regarded with a degree of suspicion. Merchants, traders, businessmen, these were all dirty and untrustworthy professions, so much so that senators, the people trusted with governing the city of Rome, were completely prohibited from being involved in trade. And no story emphasizes just how close agriculture and martial prowess were to the hearts of Republican Romans than the story of Cincinnatus, the perfect statesman, and his unscrupulous rival, Maelius. In this ancient Roman parable, Cincinnatus, our hero, divides his time between working his small plot of land and fighting Rome's enemies, whilst his rival, Maelius, is a dishonest and wealthy businessman who buys food from the neighbouring Etruscans so that he can give it to the people in times of need, hoping that this will win him some kind of favour with the people and he'll be able to make himself king. But Cincinnatus, recognising that his city is in danger of falling into the hands of a tyrant, springs into action, defeats Maelius, and kills him. He then returns to his farm where he continues to work, to provide his people with food. Any Roman who heard this story would have instantly known that the hard-working farmer who produces food with the sweat off his brow and his own hard labour was more trustworthy than the dishonest businessman who sustains his people with wealth that he gets from unscrupulous means. War and agriculture then were sort of to the Romans kind of like what freedom is to the Americans today, or sarcasm is to the Brits. You know, they may not be as unique or ubiquitous to our cultures as we might like to think, but they're still a core part of a people's identity. The kind of thing that, when mixed with a little bit of political rhetoric, might inspire feelings of joy and pride, or fear and anxiety. So that is what the early Roman Republic was like, a state of austere warrior farmers who worked their own small plots of land to feed their community and provided manpower in times of need. Or at least, that's how the Romans liked to think of themselves. Like many people throughout history and today, they have a somewhat rose-tinted, sunshine and flowers view of their own past, of a more virtuous and simpler time, you know, before the decadence and debauchery of the modern era came and ruined everything. Besides, a view of themselves like this helped contrast them with their most hated enemy, the Carthaginians, which was, you know, Carthage was a city of merchants, it was a city of traders, it was a city built on money, not agriculture. And when it came to times of war, the Carthaginians would pay for mercenaries to fight it for them, for the most part. This made them the antithesis of Roman civilization. So whether or not this incredible early republic full of dedicated and virtuous warrior farmers ever actually existed, outside of the imaginations of later Romans at least, we'll probably never know. But what's important is that it was fundamental to how the Romans viewed themselves. And this caused huge problems in the time of Tiberius Gracchus. When Rome's republic was founded, Roman territory looked like this. You see that little red dot there? That's Rome. It really was just an unimportant little city-state tucked away in the middle of Italy in this swampy little area on the river Tiber that no one really had any reason to visit. Fast forward about 350 years, and Rome looks like this. Not bad, hey? I mean, Italy is basically a Roman peninsula. They've got North Africa after defeating Carthage, Greece, Spain. Not bad going as far as empires go. This had brought an unprecedented amount of wealth into the city of Rome. But pretty much all of that had gone into the hands of the elite, the top 1%. Inequality between those who had and those who had not in the late 2nd century BCE was stark, and this was due to a number of reasons. To start with, you've got the problem of military service. Back in the day, in the early Republic, Rome's wars didn't go on for a very long time. Their enemies were primarily other Italians, people who were walking distance away, so their military campaigns were short and generally worked around the Roman agricultural calendar. When Cincinnatus went off to war, he was gone for a mere 15 days before he returned to his farm victorious. However, by the 2nd century BCE, Rome's wars were both longer and further away. Instead of spending a few weeks in the Italian hills, Roman legionaries could expect to spend years abroad, garrisoning provinces in Spain, Greece, and North Africa. As a result, when they returned home after these lengthy military services, they often found their own homes, businesses, and farms had gone destitute, their families unable to make do without them in their absence. And even without the burden of lengthy military services getting in the way of Romans being able to sustain themselves, farmers were really up against it in the 2nd century BCE. To start with, Roman inheritance law tended to split land evenly between heirs, meaning that as generations went on, family plots would get smaller and smaller. On top of that, in the late 3rd century BCE, a Carthaginian general called Hannibal Barca had marched across the Alps and invaded Italy. And although the Romans had defeated him in the end, he'd been able to spend years devastating the Italian countryside. He did such a number on Italian farms that even 80 years after his defeat, many of them hadn't recovered. So the Roman farmer at this time was really struggling. What were the nobility going to do about it? After all, in the last few decades, Rome had won an empire and unprecedented amounts of wealth had flown into their hands. What would they do? Well, for the most part, they took advantage of the situation. With so many destitute farms littered across the landscape, wealthy nobles and aristocrats could buy them up at dirt cheap prices. Soon the Italian countryside was transforming from one of small, independently owned plots of land into great agricultural estates, worked primarily by slaves. This made financial sense to the nobles. Rome had conquered and enslaved so many people over the last few years that human labor was going pretty cheap. Cheaper at least than employing a citizen worker who would need wages and had legal rights and things like that. And this had a number of detrimental effects on Roman society. To start with the average citizen getting poorer, many of them could no longer afford to equip themselves for war or meet the minimum wealth requirements to serve in the legions. So a manpower shortage was threatening Rome's ability to defend their new provinces. The poor and dispossessed made their way primarily to the city of Rome to find work. But work was hard to find. Not only were there so many of them who had lost their own small farms and businesses and made their way to the city, but the influx of foreign slaves had made human labor cheap. As a result, more and more people were wandering the streets of Rome with not enough work and not enough money, and they became pretty politically agitated. To many of them, the Romans were losing what made them great as a people, their ability to farm the land as free citizens and fight for it as legionaries. Oh, right. Back in front of the wall. In the year 133 BCE, Tiberius Gracchus was in his late 20s, and Roman society was under immense pressure. The countryside that had once been filled with small family-owned farms was being taken over by mega estates owned by the rich and worked primarily by slaves. The small farms that still remained couldn't compete with these huge estates, and over time the rich were getting richer, the poor were getting poorer, and Rome was filling with angry, poverty-stricken citizens, many of whom were veterans of the same Spanish War that Tiberius had met disgrace in. Enter Appius Claudius Pulcher, a distinguished old senator coming towards the end of a pretty successful career. He had been consul, he was well respected, and he was well liked. He was also Tiberius's new father-in-law. Marrying Claudius's daughter was a pretty interesting move on Tiberius's behalf, because Claudius had a little bit of a rivalry with Aemilianus, who was Tiberius's brother-in-law. So there's maybe a little bit of family drama going on here. The father-in-law and the brother-in-law don't particularly get along, but we'll get into that later. Tiberius's reputation in the eyes of the Senate may not have been great at this point, but Claudius could see who truly loved his new son-in-law: the regular people. Specifically the families of the soldiers whose lives he'd saved in Spain. And Claudius wants Tiberius on side for a bill that he plans to pass the following year, the Lex Agraria, or Land Bill. This law was designed to solve Rome's problems and alleviate the crisis caused by the land and manpower shortage, and it dealt with something called Ager Publicus. Ager Publicus, or common land, was something that the Romans had used for centuries. Whenever they defeated a rival, they would conquer their territory and then designate a portion of that territory to be common land, where it could be used by the regular Roman people to plant crops, graze livestock, or do anything like that. And all they had to do was pay a meagre rent of 10% of whatever they produced. This was a great insurance policy in case of a poor harvest or a land shortage, and in the eyes of Claudius and Tiberius, it had the potential to act as the safety net that so many Romans needed at this time. However, the problem, at least as Claudius and Tiberius saw it, was that so much Ager Publicus had already been co-opted by the rich for their own use. Seeing as common land was open to anyone to use, they were very much in the habit of just taking basically all of it and using it as an extension of their own property. If Ager Publicus was a handout to the poor, the rich were biting the hand clean off. Now the Romans had technically already dealt with this issue. There was a limit on the amount of Ager Publicus that a single individual could use, and this had been passed into law 200 years previously. However, because it was the rich who enforced the laws, and because it was the rich who were benefiting from being allowed to use Arga Publicus as their own free territory, the law went unenforced. And so Tiberius, now a tribune, starts campaigning for the Lex Agraria. And it's worth noting here the kind of person that Tiberius was. Because despite the reputation that he will develop down the line as a fire-breathing populist, he was actually a consciously reasonable man. He was moderate in his temperament, diplomatic by nature, and very slow to anger. This law was intended to reopen the Arga Publicus for regular Romans, and thereby help support the class of freehold farmers that was rapidly shrinking. But Tiberius wasn't going in guns a-blazing, red flag a-waving, let's eat the rich and start a revolution and redistribute all the wealth type stuff. No. He merely wished to see the pre-existing legal limits on the amount of Arga Publicus that could be used by individuals enforced. The rich would get to keep pretty much all of what they owned, and for what they lost, they would be very fairly compensated. And that sounds reasonable, right? I mean, if anything, it's a little bit lenient towards the wealthy squatters who were, after all, breaking the law and stealing from the regular Roman people. Well, Plutarch, a Greek moralist, records the reaction to Tiberius's proposal.
It is thought that a law dealing with injustice and rapacity so great was never drawn up in milder or gentler terms. For men who ought to have been punished for their disobedience, and to have surrendered with payment of a fine the land which they were illegally enjoying, these men it merely ordered to abandon their unjust acquisitions upon being paid the value, and to admit into ownership of them such citizens as needed assistance. The men of wealth and substance, however, were led by their greed to hate the law, and by their wrath and contentiousness to hate the lawgiver, and tried to dissuade the people by alleging that Tiberius was introducing a redistribution of land for the confusion of the body politic, and was stirring up general revolution.
Despite its merits and its generous terms, Tiberius's law was met by immediate and fierce opposition. And counterintuitively, we have to be kind of fair to the rich here. This was technically illegally occupied land, but it had been occupied for generations at this point. They had invested in it, they had built ancestral tombs on it, they had included it in inheritances and into dowries. To many wealthy Romans, it seemed unfair that they should give up what they had just assumed was theirs for so long. So, to persuade everybody, Tiberius defended the Lex Agraria with the speech of his life. He stood in front of the people of Rome and proclaimed,
"The wild beasts of Italy have each of them caves to lurk in, but the brave men who spill their blood in her cause share nothing but the common air and light. Without houses, without settled habitations, they wander from place to place with their wives and children, and their generals mock them when, at the heads of their armies, they exhort their men to fight for their sepulchres and the gods of their hearths. For among such numbers there is not one Roman who has an ancestral tomb or a sepulchre in which their ashes rest. The soldiers fight and die to advance the wealth and luxury of others, and though they are styled masters of the world, they have not a clod of earth that is their own."
That, viewers, is rhetorical dynamite. Can you imagine being a poor Roman wandering homeless on the streets of the city? And once upon a time, not too long ago, you had owned your own farm, your own land, and supported your family from it. And now, for no other reason other than you did your duty to your city, you have been dispossessed and left purposeless in the stinking streets, looking up at the Palatine Hill, where you see the mansions of the wealthy, paid for by your blood and the blood of your comrades. Can you imagine what kind of feelings a speech like this from the mouth of a fellow plebeian, a tribune, someone elected to represent your interests, might evoke? Wow. And so the debate raged on, and Tiberius, elegant, articulate, and dignified, begins winning the people over. He turns to the clerk of the court and says, "Can you read out my bill so the people can hear its contents and we can begin the process of voting?" But, as the clerk begins to read, another tribune, an old childhood friend of Tiberius's, a man called Marcus Octavius, stands up and declares veto. Tiberius is a little taken aback by this, so he turns to the clerk a second time and says, "Can you read my bill?" But yet again, Octavius stands up and vetoes the reading. The veto was the most powerful weapon in a tribune's arsenal. Remember that the office had been created back during the conflict of the orders to prevent the patricians from ever passing legislation that might negatively affect the plebeians. If they ever did try that, a tribune could veto it, and that was that. A veto from a tribune was absolute. The only way to undo it would be if that same tribune that declared the veto later rescinded it. What had happened was obvious. The Senate and the wealthy clearly had their own man amongst the tribunes, and they were using the office for the opposite of its intended purpose. He was going to block any legislation that might help the poor, but hurt the rich. Two camps had distinctly developed in Rome. Octavius would block any attempt by Tiberius to get his land bill passed, and Tiberius would block basically anything else. He was a tribune as well, after all, so he would just veto all public business until Octavius agreed to stop vetoing his bill. And so the two tribunes were constantly vetoing each other, blocking anything from getting done. And this was obviously completely unsustainable. So Tiberius broke the deadlock by doing something fairly shocking. He denounced Octavius in front of everyone and called for a vote to have him removed from the office of tribune. Tiberius's reasoning was sound. I mean, Octavius had been elected to the office of tribune in order to represent the interests of the people, and he was clearly acting against those interests. But this had never been done before. Tribunes were sacrosanct. They could not be harmed whilst in office, or it was a sacrilege against the gods of Rome. And removing someone from office prematurely might not technically be harm, but it was close enough that many Romans were very uncomfortable with it. Despite being controversial, the day did eventually come when a vote would be held on the continued tribunate of Marcus Octavius. The first tribe filled out their ballots, but before voting continued, Tiberius halted everything, turned to Octavius publicly, and begged him, please, please, end this farce, and voluntarily stepped down. But Octavius refused, so the voting continued. Soon enough, the voting was done and the results were in, but Tiberius delayed them being announced so that he could one last time beg Octavius to just step down. With tears in his eyes, Octavius refused, so Tiberius ordered that he be removed from the rostra. The people had voted to depose him as tribune. And it's here that we see how seriously so many of the Romans took the sanctity of the office of tribune. Tensions were high in Rome. This had been a political shambles, and the people were divided, but the debate had remained civil. But as soon as Octavius was no longer a tribune, as soon as he was no longer protected by the Roman gods, Tiberius' supporters rushed him, despite the cries of Tiberius for them to stop. In the end, Octavius got away unharmed, but only because he was protected by one of his slaves who lost an eye in defense of his master. With Octavius out of the way, Tiberius is free to pass the Lex Agraria, and a land commission is set up run by himself, his younger brother Gaius, and his father-in-law Claudius. He's won. Tiberius stands triumphant. He has limited the power of the rich and opened up common land for the regular Romans. Power to the people. Although Tiberius had got his law passed, he had made more enemies on the way there than he had ever planned to, primarily his own cousin, Cornelius Scipio Nasica, a senior senator and the Pontifex Maximus. Nasica led a campaign of pettiness and fear against Tiberius, denying any resources to his land commission to help him enforce his new law. But what was worse, he made overt threats against Tiberius, who was sacrosanct, remember. As long as he was a tribune, no one was going to harm him. But as soon as his term was up, well, what was to stop him from falling and bumping his head in the middle of the night? Or choking on some bad food? Hell, people's houses catch fire all the time in Rome. Tiberius starts to fear for his life, and not unjustifiably. He's seen taking his wife and young son into the forum, begging friends for promises that they will look after his family should anything happen to him. He would bump heads with the Senate yet again due to the Greek city of Pergamum. In 133 BCE, King Attalus of Pergamum died without an heir and left his entire city to Rome. Now, this may sound odd, and it kind of was. The bestowal of Pergamum to the Roman people will be an issue that we see arise in future episodes on the Roman Republic. But for now, just know that the Romans had been bequeathed a great deal of money and were wondering what to do with it. Tiberius reckoned that this newfound wealth should be used to benefit the regular people of Rome, getting them independent, settled, and financially secure again. But he knew that if he took this idea to the Senate, they would block it just on principle. So, he ignored them and took his ideas directly to the people to be voted on. Now, this was not illegal. Like the deposition of Octavius, there was no law saying that Tiberius couldn't do this. It was mos maiorum, that vaguely defined sense of society's rules and traditions, and that this was just the way things were done, that said that you had to take all proposals via the Senate for approval before they were voted on. Now, Tiberius wasn't a criminal for not doing this, but Rome functioned on its traditions. They were the social glue that held everything together. If Tiberius could disregard them just because they didn't suit him, what did that mean for the rest of Rome's long-established customs and rules? The Senate, naturally, took this as a huge insult, and a more serious accusation was being bandied about Tiberius Gracchus, that he wanted to be king, or tyrant, or dictator. It didn't matter. The point was that one individual held far more power in this republican system than he was supposed to. And that genuinely scared people. Tiberius started being compared unfavorably to his father, who everybody agreed was the better man. One senator even accused him of sacrilege, alluding to his removal of a fellow tribune, and Tiberius couldn't take this. He stormed out of the Senate House and addressed his followers, ordering that they bring him the senator in question, so that he could publicly denounce him. However, when this senator was brought forward, he simply said, "Oh, okay. You wish to insult me? Fair enough. But if one of my colleagues speaks in my defense, will you deprive him of his office also?" This left Tiberius, a master of rhetoric, the guy who always had something to say, speechless. He'd kind of been called out, and without really having any way to win, he had to let the senator go. But now Tiberius was really frightened. He went nowhere without his mob of supporters surrounding and protecting him, but deep down, he probably knew his days were numbered. He was simply too dangerous to too many important people not to come into harm's way as soon as the sanctity of his office no longer protected him. So, in order to stay alive, he would have to break yet more mos maiorum. He would run for a second year as tribune, which caused a mixed response. The Senate and some of Tiberius's more moderate supporters said that this was illegal and that he shouldn't do it. But his more hardcore supporters said, well, is it illegal? I mean, there is a law in the Roman books saying that a politician can't hold the same magistracy twice in a row. But that law never specifies that it applies to the tribunes, who had kind of always been their own political entity. It was just custom that tribunes only served for a single year. But Tiberius is desperate. He starts promising the people all sorts. Less military service, more restrictions on the power of the Senate, more representation in the law courts. Not bad ideas and things that people wanted, but definitely policies that he'd come up with getting elected in mind. Not the kind of let's fix Rome in the long-term sense kind of policy that he'd started off with. But then finally, the day of voting came, and despite the protests of the Senate, Tiberius and his mob of supporters made their way to the polls. A man dressed in the toga of a senator appeared to be trying to make his way towards Tiberius, but the crowd wasn't letting him get through. This man's name was Flaccus, and after a while he does manage to get Tiberius's attention, and Tiberius indicates to his supporters to let Flaccus through, and he approaches with a warning. There is a group of senators who are planning to kill Tiberius themselves. Now, it doesn't seem that Tiberius ever made a public announcement that he was in danger, but word that violence might break out does start to spread amongst the crowd, who begin to get more and more agitated and more lively. At some point, for some reason, possibly to indicate that something was wrong, Tiberius pointed at his own head. And someone saw him do that. And that person ran straight to the Temple of Fides. It was at this temple that the senators were meeting, and a lot of them were already pretty unhappy. They'd been at the voting earlier, attempting to block any of Tiberius' supporters from getting in, but the crowd had driven them off. When the messenger arrived, he announced to the senators that Tiberius had indicated at his own head, and for many, this was confirmation of what they had suspected. Tiberius was planning to use the chaos of the election to have himself crowned king. He would then rally his supporters amongst the people, kill them all, and rule Rome as a tyrant. Scipio Nasica, Tiberius's most vocal opponent, turns to the consul, the senior magistrate in the Senate, and says, "Look, it's your job to prevent tyranny from ever taking over Rome, and here a potential coup is about to happen. Go out there and do your job, arrest Tiberius and disperse his supporters." But the consul is calm. He says that this is just a fairly unruly mob participating in the perfectly legal act of voting, and if they voted for something illegal, he, the consul, would simply nullify it. What's the big deal? Nasica is not impressed by this comment. He pulls his hood over his head, the official garb of the Pontifex Maximus, Rome's head priest, and says to the senators, "Since the chief magistrate betrays the state, let those who wish to succor the laws follow me." Nasica leads a gang of senators out of the temple and into the crowd, who immediately make way for them. Yes, Rome is politically divided at the moment, and tensions are running very high, but these are still the most senior magistrates and men in the city, led by their high priest. When they're walking past, you make way for them. But this show of deference did nothing to stop what happened next. The senators equipped themselves with anything they could, stools, chair legs, bits of wood, and began beating their way into the crowd of Tiberius' supporters, who began to scatter. Tiberius himself made a run for it, but he tripped over the body of one of his fallen friends. The senators caught up with him and beat him to death in front of everyone. Tiberius Gracchus was dead before his 30th birthday, along with 300 of his supporters who fell in what turned out to be a pretty one-sided fight. When his younger brother Gaius asked for his body to be returned to him so that he might be buried along with his ancestors, as was normal in Roman society, the Senate denied him and threw Tiberius's body into the river Tiber, the very river that he was named after. The period after the violence was defined by the prosecutions and executions of many of Tiberius's supporters, who were treated not really as politicians or even as citizens, but as traitors. In the trial of one man, the defendant said, "Well, everything I did in that last year, I did at the behest of Tiberius Gracchus." But Scipio Nasica wasn't having any of this. He kept on asking things like, "Well, what if Tiberius had ordered you to set fire to the Capitoline Hill? Would you have done it?" But the defendant said, "No, that's silly. Tiberius would never give an order like that." But Nasica kept pressing him, kept on going, "Well, what if he did? What if he did? What if he did order you to do that? What if he did? What would you have done then?" Until eventually the defendant lost his temper and finally said, "You know what? Yes, I would have done it, actually. Even if Tiberius had ordered me to set fire to all of Rome, I would have done it. Because if Tiberius ordered it, that would have meant it was in the interests of the Roman people to do so." That guy, by the way, doesn't get sentenced and punished. He escapes to participate in another chapter of Roman history, one that we're going to look at in a future video that, at this rate, will be ready in like 3 or 4 years. When all of the violence and the prosecutions and the executions were over, the Senate attempted to encourage reconciliation. This had all been a big mix-up. They weren't against the people. Tiberius was dangerous and out of control. They even let the Lex Agraria, the land bill that had started this whole mess off, stand, although they heavily edited it to the point that it was basically no longer effective. This attempt to gaslight the entirety of the Roman public did not work. Scipio Nasica, the senior senator and Pontifex Maximus who had led the charge against Tiberius, claiming to be saving the Republic, found himself so unpopular that he couldn't even leave his house without having insults showered upon him. He eventually left Rome altogether, his political career and reputation in tatters, to die in, well, of all places, Pergamum. Scipio Aemilianus, the man who had destroyed Carthage and made himself beloved of the Roman people, was in Spain fighting the rest of the Numantine War when he heard about Tiberius's death, and he responded by quoting a line from Homer, saying, "So perish all those who venture on such wickedness." Aemilianus had left Rome before Tiberius was elected tribune and this whole political shambles started, so he was probably unaware of just how much fuel he was adding to the fire of this absolute mess by making such a callous comment about the death of his brother-in-law. When he returned to Rome, victorious, having defeated the Numantines once and for all, he probably expected the same kind of hero's welcome he'd gotten when he returned from Carthage. However, when he returned to the city, he found that his comment had been taken as an endorsement of the murder of a sacrosanct tribune. On a scale of 1 to Savile, his fall from grace was at least an 8. The man who had once been hailed as Rome's greatest living general, as one of the most respected men in the city, now found himself heckled whenever he tried to speak publicly. Frustrated at this, and probably more than a little surprised, he went to the countryside telling everyone he was planning his great political comeback. He'd be back and he'd show them. But he didn't. He died very shortly after leaving Rome. This anger at Rome at the sacrilege of having killed a sitting tribune and someone whom many saw as representing their interests was quickly harnessed by Tiberius's younger brother Gaius, who also got elected tribune and started fighting for many of the same causes his older brother had died for. Although the two brothers kind of shared an ideology, they were very, very different. Gaius was a far more traditional populist than his older brother had been. Where Tiberius was reserved, respectful and quiet, Gaius was loud and provocative and emotional. Where Tiberius, at least at first, had attempted to achieve his goals through compromise, Gaius knew who was really on his side. He bumped heads with the Senate immediately and very much courted the people. And therefore, despite seeing maybe more success than his older brother had, he eventually shared the same fate. He too was murdered in the streets of Rome by agents of the Senate. Cornelia, the mother of the Gracchi, got what she always wanted and what she'd always pushed her sons to achieve. To this day, we remember her not as the daughter of Scipio or as the mother-in-law of Aemilianus, but as the mother of Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. She would live for another 20 years after the death of her sons, retiring to the small town of Misenum, where she would host philosophers, statesmen, artists, and even royalty from all around the Mediterranean world. They would converse on all topics, from philosophy to science to history, but whenever the conversation turned to her dead sons, Cornelia would spook her guests by talking about them without any grief or sadness in her voice, as if they weren't her children, but historic heroes from Rome's early past. Of Cornelia's later years and the way that she spoke about her sons, the Greek writer Plutarch tells us,
"Some were therefore led to think that old age or the greatness of her sorrows had impaired her mind and made her insensible to her misfortunes, whereas, really, such persons themselves were insensible how much help in the banishment of grief mankind derives from a noble nature, and from honourable birth and rearing, as well as of the fact that while fortune often prevails over virtue when it endeavours to ward off evils, she cannot rob virtue of the power to endure those evils with calm assurance."
After the death of both of the Gracchi, the Senate, in one final act of attempted reconciliation, renovated the old temple of Concordia. Concordia was the goddess of harmony and getting along with each other, and the temple had first been erected after the first conflict of the orders had been resolved centuries ago. But this didn't work either. No sooner was the scaffolding down than someone graffitied on the side of the building, "This temple of concord is the work of mad discord." So what was so important about Tiberius Gracchus? I mean, I started this video talking about the Roman Republic and its eventual collapse into autocracy. And granted, I've gotten a little bit carried away in some areas, this is a very, very long video, and fair play if you're still here. But what does any of this drama with the Gracchi brothers have to do with the fall of the Roman Republic? Which won't happen for another 100 years after Tiberius's death. And it's not like they got much done. I mean, both of them were murdered, and very little of their legislation or their policy survived the decades after their death. Well, it's precisely that. They died. That's the most important thing that they really did regarding their contribution to Roman history. It's one of the reasons that I've kind of done Gaius, the younger brother, pretty dirty in this video. He was as, if not more, important than his older brother. But the thing about Tiberius Gracchus is, he was the first one to die. The story that I've just told you about Tiberius's life and career is pulled primarily from two sources. There's Plutarch, a 1st century Greek moralist who writes parallel lives biographies on people, and there's Appian, a historian from the 2nd century CE. Appian's book was called The Civil Wars, and they're about the violence and, well, civil wars that will take place in Rome just before the Republic falls. And there's a very good reason that he starts his book with the story of Tiberius Gracchus. Appian tells us,
"At Rome, the common people and the Senate were frequently at odds with each other over the passing of laws and the cancellation of debts, or the distribution of land, or during elections. But there was never any outbreak of civil violence. No sword was ever brought into the assembly, and no Roman ever killed by a Roman, until Tiberius Gracchus."
Now, this is obviously not quite right. Rome was founded on an act of fratricide, so it's kind of silly to say, oh, there was no violence between citizens in Rome before Tiberius Gracchus. But it's not really supposed to be taken literally. Both Plutarch and Appian write after the fall of the Roman Republic, which, as we'll see in future videos, was a pretty violent affair. And when looking for a place to start the story of this violence, Tiberius Gracchus was the obvious one. The Gracchi in their lifetimes had divided the Roman people in two, and their deaths solidified that divide and ensured it would be completely irreconcilable. The self-interested nature of the wealthy was made obvious for everyone to bear. The traditions of Mos Maiorum, those unwritten codes and rules of society that had never been broken before, were now permanently severed. And with violence becoming more and more normalized, Roman political life would become increasingly dangerous. The power of the mob had also been harnessed really for the first time in a long time, and regular Roman people went from being part of the electorate to being a kind of political gang. Tiberius himself is a kind of tragic figure. He probably never wanted to be the person who lifted the lid on all of these bubbling under-the-surface tensions. He found himself caught between the people who he was elected to represent and the aristocrats amongst whom he had been raised. In the end, though, he got what he'd been working towards his entire life. Although he lived very much in the shadow of his father, it is he, the son, who we remember nowadays, and it was he, Tiberius Gracchus, who would be remembered by future Romans either as a hero or as a villain. But most importantly, he's known as the first casualty of the Roman Republic's fall. He won't be the last, not by a long shot, but you're going to have to wait for future videos to see that. Thank you all for watching.